Everybody, I'm here with Chris Rufo. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a filmmaker, he's an author, he's an activist, and someone very interested in exploring some of the intellectual roots of wokeism, of critical race theory, et cetera. And this interest brings him close to my own interests. And he's just come out with this book, America's Cultural Revolution. So, Chris, thanks for being with us today. And I'm eager to explore these themes with you. Can I begin with this? Often when I become critical of wokeism within a Catholic framework, people say, well, wait a minute, how could you be critical of wokeism? It just means you're awake to social injustice, you're concerned for the poor, and you want to do something about it. And wasn't Martin Luther King woke, and Dorothy Day was woke, and isn't Catholic social teaching essentially woke? And a lot of my time is spent saying, well, no, it's coming out of a very different philosophical matrix. Catholic social teaching is coming out of I'd say, essentially biblical matrix. And wokeism is from somewhere else. And I found your book very helpful in exploring some of that. Just talk to me a little bit about that problem that some of us face when we're critical of it. It's like, well, what do you mean? Shouldn't everyone be for social justice?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that the big phenomenon that's happening that really confuses people is that woke ideology or left-wing racialist ideology operates at two levels. There's a level of euphemism, all of which sound very nice. They're very pleasing. It's diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, solidarity sometimes. But then if you actually dig under the euphemisms, which are marketing words, you find an ideology that is very different. It doesn't stem from certainly the Christian tradition. It doesn't stem from the natural rights tradition. It doesn't stem from the kind of traditional mid-century civil rights tradition.
It's against all those things.
It's against all of those things. And so you have to actually do your homework. You actually have to understand where it comes from. And where it comes from is a couple of different traditions, but most prominently Marxism or neo-Marxism. You have someone like Herbert Marcuse. You have the Black radical tradition, which is an atheist tradition, a militant revolutionary tradition that sought to overturn the system of government in the United States. And then you have this really ugly brew of postmodernism and gender theory that seeks to erase the very basic fabric of the cosmos. It rejects the kind of world of creation in favor of a world of unlimited human manipulation. And so what I've tried to do with the book is essentially that, is to say, let's look at the euphemisms, but let's look underneath them to find what's really happening.
Do you find some of that neo-Gnostic, the oldest heresy in the church that keeps asserting itself century in, century out, and the view that, the real me is kind of hidden deep in there somewhere, and the body is malleable, the body can be changed according to the whims of the real inner self. And of course, the church recognized very early on, go back to St. Irenaeus in the 2nd century, that's repugnant to a Christian or biblical anthropology. Do you find some of that neo-Gnostic in form?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's most pronounced on gender because, look, I think politics is largely driven in the United States by the left on race issues. That's the great mechanism by which they feel they can change the structures of society, the economy, the law, the Constitution, et cetera. But there's a separate strain that has a separate lineage, and we think of it as gender theory, we think of it as the kind of trans activism, and that's very much predicated on the rejection of any concept of human nature. Human nature is what they call a kind of normative structure. It's part of the sexual normativity, which is an oppressive structure that's created by human invention. And they actually believe that they can manipulate the physical world, the biological world, to meet any ideological demand. Men can become women, men can become pregnant, whatever kind of small phrases that you might have heard are based on this idea of a rejection of any natural limits and using technology to transcend not just the categories of male and female, which are embedded in the human experience, but actually
in our biology all the way down. I mean, every level of biology,
all the way
gender.
Down. If you look at it from a scientific account, if you look at it from a biblical account, but they actually think that they can transcend the limitation of human nature as such. And so it's a movement that is at the end of the day an anti-human movement, and you see it most pronounced. And a lot of the reporting that I've done recently is looking at where this leads in medical practice. And you have some surgical procedures that they're doing that are far beyond Dr. Frankenstein. I mean, you know, things that are so horrific. It's almost hard to mention, but they really believe that there is no human essence.
Right.
That it's all accidental. It's all contingent.
You know that term they use a lot, essentialism, right, as a disparaging term. And it's a Sartrean thing, isn't it? Where Sartre says, you know, my existentialism means that existence precedes essence. So my freedom comes first, then I decide who or what I am. Well, that's, you know, from the French Salon of the 1940s and 50s. Well, now it's in the mind of every teenager in America, right? And essentialism, some view that there's a nature, there's a givenness to our bodies, to our anthropology. That's the problem. That's oppressive, right? But that's repugnant to our Catholic social teaching. One reason why Pope Francis, and I can tell you this from direct experience, he told us when I was a bishop out in California, I want you to stand against the gender ideology because it's repugnant to the Bible and to our anthropology. And we're on dangerous ground, aren't we? When we start playing that game of my existence completely trumps essence.
Yeah, I mean, we're on dangerous ground, but I think most importantly, if you look at it as a practical matter, it just doesn't work.
Oh, right.
It is disproven over and over and over. And that's really the problem with all of these revolutionary ideologies. At the end of the day, they are revolutions against nature, against human nature, against the social essence of what makes us human beings in community. And they have this romantic and idealistic notion, which is very attractive to people, especially young people, that you can overcome any limitation. That actually the limitations, the proscriptions of human nature are structures of oppression that can be abolished. And so it's very attractive to people, but ultimately the theme in the book, the process that you see in the revolution and the process you see in all these revolutions is one of idealism turning into disillusionment, turning into nihilism. Mm-hmm. And you see that largely in the philosophical line of thought and philosophical reasoning. You see it personally in many of these stories of the thinkers of the time. But then you also see it, and this is the most tragic and devastating, in the lives of people who are manipulated by these ideologies.
Right.
So those kids
who are suffering from it. It's not just an abstraction. Right.
And I think that you have to tell them quite the opposite. There is an essence. Mm-hmm. There is a human nature. There is a way that things ought to be. And there are kind of a component of that is there are limitations that you should not only respect as limitations, but actually those limitations are what give us the constraints and the bounds of being human.
Right.
And I think that it's something that people are hesitant to teach people are hesitant to even say.
Don't you think it's contingent in a way upon that modern sense of freedom as pure choice? You know, I hover indifferently above the yes and the no, and I can decide purely on the basis of my own integrity which way I'm going to go. Where classical freedom, biblical and classical freedom, is more the disciplining of desire so as to make the achievement of the good effortless. So I become a free speaker of English. I become a free player of the piano, a free golfer, in the measure that I submit myself to these objective norms. And the more I internalize those norms, the freer I become to golf or to speak or whatever. But see, I think that view of freedom has been so occluded by this modern sense of freedom, of self-invention. But I think that's why you see the numbers on depression, anxiety, suicidality among young people spiking. That's a terrible space to live in, where I've got to invent my own values. I invent this on the basis of my own freedom. That's where I quite agree with you. I think there's a real danger. It's not just a theoretical problem. This is a real existential problem, isn't it?
I think that is. And I think that if you look at it, it's at heart an unlimited freedom leads to nihilism. Right. Because all that you have is the ego and unlimited choice. I mean, boundless choice. It's this open terrain. But it's a brutal place to put people because ultimately it's false. Right. There aren't unlimited choices. And sure, we should seek to maximize our free expression. We should seek to find our own essence. We should seek to cultivate ourselves towards our genius. But doing that in an unlimited environment of choices is very destructive. And I think it's also, it untethers freedom from responsibility. And so the classical notions of freedom were hitched. I mean, it was explained to me once in a very good way as freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. And freedom for what is the essential question. And what I found in my work not just intellectually writing the book, but in my practical work as a trustee of a public college in Florida, for example, working on reforms in higher education, is that I ask academics and I ask my critics, okay, free inquiry, freedom of speech, freedom to create new academic departments. For what?
Right, for what?
Toward what?
Yeah.
And you get this blank look. They look at you like you're a crazy person.
Because teleology disappeared with modernity. I mean, you see it in the sciences, then you see it in the human sciences. If teleology disappears, all that's left is my self-generating freedom.
That's right.
But classically, freedom from sin in a religious context, or freedom from attachment, freedom from addiction, so I can be free for the attainment of the good. That would be the way a classical mind would think about it. But the modern reading is freedom from any kind of external oppression, so I can find freedom for self-expression. That's a dead end, though. I think that's a fundamental shift that in some ways has given rise to a lot of this business.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that if you look at that as the basic philosophical bedrock of these movements,
Yes.
and then it shifts, though. It becomes very interesting because they attack on various lines. You have race, you have gender, you have a couple of other kind of minor lines of attack.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I was perplexed by looking at the figures in the book, I profile 4 of the great revolutionaries of the 1960s and 70s that have had the most profound impact on our culture today, really exposed in 2020 when all of our institutions were captured by these ideologies. But I reading their work, listening to their interviews, looking at their letters and correspondence, investigating their body of thought in a way that hadn't been done before in this manner. I was always asking them, in dialogue with the study, is what do they actually want? What is their vision of the good? What does social justice mean to them? What does liberation entail? And text after text after text, it was an empty answer.
Right.
It was they were very good at describing the systems of oppression in their mind, but their solutions were nothing more than appeals to these vague terms that were signifiers with no signified. They were kind of words without meaning. Yeah. So, okay, well, what does liberation look like? What do you want? And I think that ultimately, what happens is that they have charged the negative side of the dialectic, meaning that they can kind of chew up, they can deconstruct, they can dismantle, they can criticize, they can load any kind of negative critique of the systems as they exist, but can never answer that question, what ought they be? It's a purely negative conception, and that's why I think that especially young people and parents of young people that are looking at their institutions, there's a gnawing sense that there's no there. Yeah. That it's an empty ideology.
The world of objective value kind of evanesced. Classically, there's values that appear, moral values, aesthetic values, epistemic values. And the elders were meant to sort of draw young people into that world. Let me show you the beauty of this mathematical truth, or let me show you this Gothic cathedral, let me show you this moral excellence. And now bring your freedom into line with those so that you might, in your distinctive way, and I think that's where the individualism comes in legitimately. In your distinctive way, you're going to become, intellectual or a moral agent or an artist, right? But see, that got mixed up at the beginning of modernity, it seems to me, and we're seeing in some ways the full, consequence of that. I do want to go back to the central argument of your book, which I think is really important, and I haven't heard it articulated quite this way before. And let me see if I get this right. That the really radical movements, late 60s, early 70s in our country. So think of the Weather Underground, think of Angela Davis, think of the Black Panther movement. I remember those as a kid. When I was a little 10-year-old kid, those were, kind of haunting our imagination. That they dramatically failed politically at that time. I mean, they really tried in some sense to launch a revolution. They dramatically failed. But they didn't go away. They went largely into academia. So the leaders of those movements went into academia. And there was a long gestation